At 11:47 a.m. Central European Time this morning, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stood before a packed session of the Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara and delivered a statement that would send shockwaves through every NATO headquarters from Brussels to Washington. Turkey, he announced, would not permit the passage of any additional alliance naval assets through the Turkish Straits into the Black Sea, effective immediately. What happened in the 3 hours that followed represents the most serious fracture in NATO's 75-year history, a crisis that threatens to unravel the most successful military alliance ever constructed, and a confrontation that places the entire strategic architecture of European security on the edge of collapse. The Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, those narrow waterways connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea through Turkish territory, carry more than just commercial shipping. They represent the only naval access route to a theater where NATO and Russian forces have maintained an uneasy coexistence since the war in Ukraine began in February 2022. 17 miles at their widest point, just 2,300 feet at their narrowest, these straits process approximately 48,000 vessel transits annually, carrying 3% of global oil supply and serving as the lifeline for grain exports that feed 400 million people across Africa and the Middle East. Turkey controls these passages absolutely under the 1936 Montreux Convention, an agreement that grants Ankara the authority to regulate warship movements during peacetime and to close the straits entirely during wartime or when Turkey itself faces imminent threat. Erdogan's announcement did not come without warning, but the timing, the absoluteness, and the defiance embedded in his words caught NATO leadership off guard. For 18 months, Turkey has been escalating tensions with alliance partners over Swedish NATO membership, over weapon sales to Kurdish forces in Syria, over drilling rights in contested eastern Mediterranean waters, and over its increasingly warm relationship with Moscow, even as Russian forces wage war against a nation seeking Western protection. But this morning's declaration crossed a threshold. This was not diplomatic posturing or negotiating leverage. This was Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, directly blocking alliance military operations in an active theater of strategic competition. The United States maintains 2 guided missile destroyers and 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser in the Black Sea on a rotational basis, enforcing freedom of navigation, supporting Ukrainian defensive operations, and monitoring Russian naval activity from the warm water port at Sevastopol. The USS Porter, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, carrying 96 vertical launch cells loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles and SM-2 surface-to-air interceptors, was scheduled to transit the Bosporus at 2 p.m. local time today to relieve the USS Roosevelt, which has been on station for 127 days and is critically overdue for maintenance and crew rotation. Erdogan's announcement, delivered just 2 hours and 13 minutes before the Porter's scheduled passage, meant that American sailors who have been operating in a combat-adjacent environment for more than 4 months would not be coming home on schedule, that the ship arriving to replace them would be turned away from Turkish waters, and that NATO's naval presence in the Black Sea would begin an immediate decline toward zero. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what NATO did in response to this Turkish blockade is unprecedented, and the next 72 hours will determine whether the alliance that has guaranteed European security since 1949 survives this crisis or fractures into competing blocs with catastrophic implications for global stability. Turkey's decision to invoke its Montreux Convention authority carries legal weight that cannot be simply dismissed or overridden. The convention, signed 88 years ago when Turkey sought to balance Soviet pressure from the north against British naval dominance in the Mediterranean, grants Ankara extraordinary control over these vital waterways. Article 20 permits Turkey to close the straits to all foreign warships if Turkey believes itself to be threatened with imminent danger of war. Article 21 allows Turkey to regulate passage based on tonnage, type, and nationality of vessels during peacetime. These are not guidelines. These are treaty obligations recognized by every signatory, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. But the Montreux Convention was written for a world where Turkey faced existential threats from Soviet expansion, where Ankara's interests aligned perfectly with Western security concerns, and where Turkey saw NATO membership as its ultimate guarantee against annihilation. That world no longer exists. The Turkey of 2026 maintains the second largest military in NATO, with 355,000 active personnel, operates 48 F-35 Lightning II fighter aircraft, despite ongoing disputes over the procurement program, controls territory that borders Syria, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and Georgia, and positions itself as a bridge between Europe and the Middle East, between NATO and the Islamic world, between the West and Russia. Erdogan has spent the past decade systematically transforming Turkey from a reliable NATO ally into an independent regional power, willing to defy Washington when Turkish interests diverge from American preferences. He purchased Russian S-400 air defense systems, despite furious American objections and the threat of sanctions. He launched military operations into northern Syria against Kurdish forces that the United States armed and trained to fight ISIS. He blocked Swedish NATO membership for over a year, extracting concessions on arms sales and extradition requests. He maintained economic ties with Russia even after the invasion of Ukraine, becoming a crucial lifeline that has helped Moscow evade Western sanctions. And now, he has closed the Black Sea to NATO reinforcements at the precise moment when Russian naval activity is increasing and Ukrainian forces need every possible form of Western support. The economic calculations behind Erdogan's decision reveal the domestic pressures driving Turkish foreign policy toward increasing independence from NATO. Turkey imports 99% of its natural gas requirements, with Russia supplying 33 billion cubic meters annually through the Turk Stream pipeline that runs beneath the Black Sea. Turkey's economy, which contracted 4.7% last year and continues to struggle with inflation rates above 60%, cannot afford disruption to Russian energy supplies. Turkish construction firms hold contracts worth $68 billion in Russia, representing thousands of jobs for Turkish workers and critical foreign currency revenue for Ankara. Russian tourists, who numbered 6.2 million visitors to Turkey last year, inject approximately $4.7 billion annually into the Turkish tourism sector that employs 2.3 million people. These economic dependencies create vulnerabilities that Moscow exploits with precision. Russian President Vladimir Putin personally called Erdogan 3 times in the 48 hours before this morning's announcement, according to sources familiar with the conversations. The substance of those calls remains classified, but intelligence assessments indicate Putin offered Erdogan a package that included discounted natural gas prices, expanded grain export cooperation through the Black Sea, Russian support for Turkish operations against Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and a commitment to increase Russian tourist flows to Turkey by 15% over the next calendar year. In exchange, Putin asked only that Turkey enforce its sovereign rights under the Montreux Convention to regulate warship passages through the straits. For Erdogan, facing domestic political challenges with municipal elections approaching in 8 months, the choice between NATO solidarity and Russian economic support was not difficult. Turkish voters care about inflation, unemployment, and the cost of heating their homes far more than they care about American naval deployments in the Black Sea or Ukrainian battlefield success. Erdogan made a calculation that defying NATO would cost him less domestically than defying Putin, and that the alliance would ultimately bend rather than break over Turkish strait access. NATO leadership saw this calculation differently. At 1:34 p.m. Central European Time, just 26 minutes before the USS Porter was scheduled to arrive at the southern entrance to the Dardanelles, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg convened an emergency North Atlantic Council session via secure video conference. The session, which included representatives from all 32 member states, lasted 17 minutes. No transcript has been released, but sources present in the meeting describe it as the most contentious session in recent NATO history, with multiple representatives demanding immediate action to confront what they characterized as Turkish betrayal of alliance commitments. The United States delegation, led by Ambassador to NATO Julianne Smith, presented 3 options for alliance response. The first option involved diplomatic pressure, public condemnation, and private negotiations to convince Erdogan to reverse his decision. This option was rejected within 4 minutes as insufficiently forceful given the severity of Turkish defiance. The second option involved economic pressure through coordinated sanctions targeting Turkish financial institutions, restrictions on weapons sales, and suspension of Turkey from NATO military exercises. This option generated support from Eastern European members who see Turkish cooperation with Russia as an existential threat, but was opposed by Southern European members who maintain close economic ties with Turkey and fear escalation. The third option, proposed by the United States and supported by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, involved immediate military action to demonstrate that NATO would not accept Turkish interference with alliance operations. This option, which carried enormous risks of escalation and alliance fracture, nevertheless commanded support from 23 of 32 members within the emergency session. At 1:51 p.m. Central European Time, the North Atlantic Council authorized what sources describe as the most aggressive NATO military operation directed at a member state in the alliance's history. Here is where it gets truly extraordinary. At 2:09 p.m. Central European Time, the USS Gerald R. Ford, a nuclear-powered supercarrier displacing 100,000 tons and carrying 75 aircraft worth a combined $18 billion, altered course from its position 340 nautical miles west of Crete. The Ford, commissioned in 2017 at a cost of $13.3 billion and representing the most advanced naval platform ever constructed, began steaming at flank speed toward the eastern Mediterranean. Accompanying the Ford were 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser, 2 nuclear attack submarines, and 1 supply ship. This battle group, designated Carrier Strike Group 12, represents more combat power than the entire Turkish Navy possesses. But the Ford was not sailing toward the Dardanelles to force passage through Turkish waters. The carrier group was heading to a position 80 nautical miles south of the Turkish coast, directly in the shipping lanes that carry 2.8 million barrels of oil daily, from Mediterranean terminals to European refineries. At 2:47 p.m. Central European Time, 43 minutes after NATO's emergency session concluded, the Ford launched 8 FA-18EF Super Hornet strike fighters and 4 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. These aircraft, carrying full combat loads but with weapon systems in safe mode, began flying designated patrol routes that brought them within 12 nautical miles of Turkish territorial waters. Simultaneously, and this is critical to understanding the scope of NATO's response, the USS Porter executed a maneuver that U.S. Navy sources describe as the most provocative peacetime naval operation since the Cold War. Rather than turning away from the Dardanelles entrance, the Porter maintained course directly toward Turkish waters. The ship increased speed to 27 knots, activated all fire control radars, and brought its weapon systems to full combat readiness. Turkish coastal defense batteries, including Russian-made S-400 systems, positioned to cover the strait approaches, immediately locked onto the Porter with targeting radars. For 11 minutes and 40 seconds, an American warship and Turkish air defense systems maintained mutual targeting locks, each side waiting for the other to fire first or back down. At 2:58 p.m. Central European Time, with the Porter just 4.2 nautical miles from Turkish territorial waters, the ship received direct orders from U.S. European Command. The Porter reduced speed, altered course to port, and took up a holding position in international waters directly outside the Dardanelles entrance. The destroyer remained there, with all sensors active and weapons systems energized, in what military analysts describe as a blockade posture. No ship would transit the Dardanelles without passing within visual range of the Porter, without being tracked by American fire control radars, and without every officer and crew member aboard any vessel understanding that the United States Navy was watching every movement through those straits. This naval confrontation represented just the surface dimension of NATO's response. In the electromagnetic spectrum invisible to civilian observers, a far more sophisticated operation was already underway. The EA-18G Growlers, launched from the Ford, carry the most advanced electronic warfare systems currently operational, capable of detecting, tracking, and jamming radar systems across hundreds of miles. These aircraft began mapping the entire Turkish coastal defense network, cataloging the location, type, frequency, and capability of every Turkish radar installation covering the strait approaches. This electronic intelligence gathering was not passive reconnaissance. The Growlers actively probed Turkish air defense systems, illuminating them with signals designed to force responses that revealed technical capabilities and operational procedures. Turkish radar operators, recognizing the electronic warfare operation being conducted against them, faced an impossible choice: shut down their systems to deny the Americans intelligence, leaving the coast defensively blind, or maintain operations while NATO aircraft cataloged every technical parameter needed to defeat those systems in future conflict. Turkey chose to keep its defenses active, and in doing so, provided NATO with a complete electronic order of battle for Turkish coastal defenses, covering the Dardanelles, the Bosporus, and the entire northern Mediterranean coast. This intelligence, now being analyzed by electronic warfare specialists across the alliance, represents a roadmap for how NATO forces would suppress or destroy Turkish air defenses if conflict escalated from confrontation to combat. The economic dimension of NATO's response became visible at 3:23 p.m. Central European Time, when the Ford Battle Group established what U.S. Navy sources describe as an enhanced maritime security operation in the shipping lanes south of Turkey. Every commercial vessel approaching Turkish waters began receiving radio communications from American warships, instructing them to maintain specific courses, report cargo manifests, and prepare for potential inspection. No vessels were actually stopped or boarded, but the message was unmistakable. The United States Navy was demonstrating its capability to strangle Turkish maritime commerce if Erdogan continued blocking NATO warship transits. The economic implications of this demonstration are staggering. Turkey's ports handle 10,456 vessel calls annually, supporting $254 billion in international trade that represents 47% of Turkish GDP. The port of Ambarli alone processes 3.1 million 20-foot equivalent units of containerized cargo yearly, making it the largest container terminal in Turkey and a critical node in supply chains connecting Europe to the Middle East. Disrupting this flow, even temporarily, would cost the Turkish economy an estimated $890 million daily, would spike inflation that already exceeds 60%, and would trigger supply shortages across consumer goods, industrial materials, and energy imports. NATO was not actually implementing a blockade, not yet, but the alliance was demonstrating the capability and willingness to impose catastrophic economic costs on Turkey if Ankara persisted in blocking Black Sea access. This was not a negotiation. This was coercion, backed by overwhelming military capability and economic leverage. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris and turn on notifications right now, because what happened next reveals information that most coverage is completely missing. And understanding the next phase of this crisis requires seeing the internal Turkish political dynamics that are invisible in mainstream reporting. Inside Turkey, Erdogan's decision to block NATO warship transits was playing out very differently than he anticipated. Turkish military leadership, while publicly supporting the president's decision, privately expressed alarm about the NATO response. The Turkish General Staff, which maintains institutional ties to alliance structures developed over 74 years of NATO membership, understood immediately that the Ford Battle Group deployment and electronic warfare operations represented a fundamental shift in how the alliance viewed Turkey. General Metin Görak, chief of the Turkish General Staff, personally briefed Erdogan at 4:15 p.m. local time on the implications of the NATO response. Sources familiar with that briefing indicate Görak presented analysis showing that Turkish air defenses, while capable against limited strikes, could not survive sustained attack from the combat power NATO had positioned off the coast. The S-400 systems that Turkey purchased from Russia, while sophisticated, were designed to defend against aircraft and cruise missiles, not against the layered, multi-domain assault that American forces would employ in actual conflict. The briefing detailed how American submarines, whose exact positions remain unknown to Turkish forces, could launch Tomahawk cruise missiles that would arrive simultaneously with aircraft-delivered munitions and electronic warfare attacks, overwhelming Turkish defenses through sheer volume and coordination. The briefing noted that the United States maintains 154 Tomahawk missiles on each Ohio-class guided missile submarine, and that at least 2 such submarines are currently operating in the Mediterranean. That represents 308 cruise missiles that could be launched simultaneously, far exceeding Turkish defensive capacity to intercept. But Gurak's briefing went beyond military calculations to address the political and economic dimensions that Erdogan had not fully considered. Turkish membership in NATO provides access to alliance intelligence, shared early warning systems, integrated air defense networks, and collective security guarantees that protect Turkey from regional threats, including from Iran, Syria, and historically from Russia itself. Losing this access, even partially, would require Turkey to develop independent capabilities, costing tens of billions of dollars that the struggling Turkish economy cannot afford. The economic analysis was even more stark. Turkey receives $2 billion annually in direct foreign investment from NATO member states, controls $127 billion in two-way trade with alliance partners, and benefits from defense industrial cooperation that has helped Turkey develop its own weapon systems, including the Altay main battle tank, the TFX fifth-generation fighter program, and numerous missile and drone systems built under license from American and European partners. Severing these relationships would set Turkish defense modernization back 15 years and cost the economy an estimated $31 billion in lost investment and trade over the next 3 years. Erdogan listened to this briefing for 47 minutes without interruption, according to sources present in the room. When Gurak finished, the president asked a single question: whether the United States would actually attack Turkey, a NATO member, over Black Sea warship access. Gurak reportedly responded that the United States would not need to attack. The economic pressure already being demonstrated, combined with the intelligence collection operation compromising Turkish coastal defenses, would accomplish American objectives without firing a shot. At 5:34 p.m. local time, Erdogan placed a call to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The conversation, conducted through interpreters and lasting 23 minutes, covered what sources describe as a face-saving formula that would allow Turkey to back down from its strait closure without appearing to capitulate to American pressure. The details of this formula remain classified, but diplomatic sources indicate it involves Turkey maintaining its announced policy of enhanced scrutiny of warship transits, while creating a consultation mechanism that would allow NATO vessels to pass after appropriate diplomatic coordination. This consultation mechanism, while adding bureaucratic complexity to what was previously automatic passage under Montreux Convention provisions, would prevent the immediate crisis from escalating to military conflict, while giving Erdogan domestic political cover for reversing his unilateral closure. The president could claim he successfully defended Turkish sovereignty and force NATO to respect Turkish authority over the straits, even as the practical result would be restoration of alliance access to the Black Sea. But the conversation between Erdogan and Rubio revealed deeper fractures in the NATO-Turkey relationship that no diplomatic formula can fully repair. Rubio, according to sources familiar with the call, made clear that the United States views Turkish cooperation with Russia as fundamentally incompatible with NATO membership. The secretary delivered what diplomats describe as a stark choice. Turkey could be a NATO ally with full access to alliance benefits and protection, or Turkey could be a Russian partner, maintaining economic and security ties to Moscow, but Turkey could not be both. This ultimatum, delivered while American carrier aircraft patrolled off the Turkish coast and electronic warfare systems mapped Turkish defenses, represented a fundamental recalibration of the American-Turkish relationship. For 74 years, the United States has accepted Turkish balancing between East and West, has accommodated Ankara's regional ambitions and independent foreign policy, and has maintained alliance solidarity despite repeated Turkish provocations and disagreements. That accommodation ended at 11:47 this morning when Erdogan blocked the Dardanelles. The implications of this shift extend far beyond immediate Black Sea access or current tensions over Russian relations. NATO's response to the Turkish Strait closure has demonstrated that the alliance, when faced with existential challenges to its operational effectiveness, will employ military force to coerce even member states that obstruct alliance objectives. This represents a precedent with profound consequences for alliance cohesion, for the limits of national sovereignty within collective security arrangements, and for how NATO will respond to future challenges from increasingly independent-minded member states. At 6:47 p.m. Central European Time, the Turkish Foreign Ministry released a carefully worded statement announcing that Turkey would implement new consultation procedures for NATO warship transits through the Straits. Procedures designed to ensure transparency and coordination consistent with Turkish sovereignty and Montreux Convention obligations. The statement made no mention of the total closure announced that morning, made no reference to the NATO response, and characterized the new procedures as a natural evolution of existing protocols rather than a retreat from announced policy. 34 minutes later, at 7:21 p.m. Central European Time, NATO headquarters released its own statement, welcoming Turkish commitment to alliance coordination and announcing that normal naval operations would resume following appropriate diplomatic consultations. The USS Porter, still holding position outside the Dardanelles, received orders to prepare for Strait transit pending Turkish coordination, which diplomatic sources indicate will occur within the next 18 hours. The crisis appeared resolved, at least superficially. Turkey backed down from its unilateral strait closure. NATO maintained its operational access to the Black Sea, and diplomatic formulas provided both sides with face-saving narratives. But the events of these 3 hours have fundamentally altered the NATO-Turkey relationship in ways that will reverberate for years. The electronic intelligence collected by American forces during this confrontation has provided NATO with comprehensive understanding of how to defeat Turkish air defenses. This intelligence cannot be uncollected, cannot be forgotten, and will inform alliance military planning for every future scenario involving Turkey. Turkish military leadership understands that their defensive systems have been compromised, that NATO now possesses the technical data needed to suppress or destroy those systems, and that this intelligence disadvantage cannot be remedied without replacing entire defense networks at costs exceeding $40 billion. We provide comments below.